My interest is in dialogue to understand. I also want to point out to you that this ain't my town. You know, let me say this again. This ain't my town. Which means now, I understand the irony here, because I am moderating a discussion in a place that's not my town, which means I don't begin to understand what it is that you're dealing with. But I can moderate a dialogue by which you can have a discussion. I leave this notion of your town to people who are on the panel. They know the town better than I do. You know, so, but hopefully we'll have that discussion. Now, what I want to do is introduce everybody here, allow them to introduce themselves in a short fashion. Real short fashion.
Hi,
my name's Saint McCauley.
I'm Nyesha McCauley, and you're watching AccessTV.org.
This ain't my town. You know, let me say this again. This ain't my town. Which means now, I understand the irony here, because I am moderating a discussion in a place that's not my town, which means I don't begin to understand what it is that you're dealing with. But I can moderate a dialogue by which you can have a discussion. I leave this notion of your town to people who are on the panel. They know the town better than I do. You know, so, but hopefully we'll have that discussion. Now, what I want to do is introduce everybody here, allow them to introduce themselves in a short fashion. Real short fashion. Okay, so if I can start with Cheryl. Cheryl, you start, and remember what I said about short fashion. Thank you, Cheryl.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Sharp, and I can be wordy, I guess, and that's why I'm getting the finger pointing with all the emphasis. I am an attorney, and I am the Deputy Director of the State of Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. We are a state agency. We're the state agency where you file a complaint of discrimination if you believe that you were subjected to racial profiling, if you believe that a traffic stop was based on a protected class status. A protected class status is an immutable trait. We all have them. Everyone sitting in this room belongs to a protected class. Race, sex, color, gender. In the state of Connecticut, we have 27 protected classes. Every protected class is important. No one wants to be targeted based on their protected class status. And in being brief, I'm going to say this. There are 4 kinds of evidence. The statistical evidence that is gathered and that the researchers use at Central Connecticut is one type of evidence that gives you a picture of whether or not there is discrimination in a given case. But there then are 3 other kinds of evidence that in a case we look at, and it's pattern, it's circumstantial, and it's direct evidence. So pattern, circumstantial, direct, and statistical evidence, we evaluate all 4 kinds of evidence to make a determination as to whether discrimination has occurred. So I would agree with what Ken said earlier. It is informative, it's instructive to look at the data to see what is happening throughout the state of Connecticut as it relates to people being stopped and why they're being stopped, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Hopefully that was brief enough.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Next, TJ, go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. My name is TJ Clark. I am a member of the Hartford City Council, and I represent the entire city of Hartford. I'm also a resident of the Blue Hills neighborhood. I am the co-chair of the Quality of Life and Public Safety Department, where we work with really the police department regarding public safety matters and also quality of life issues, which this will fall under the umbrella of that. And so more importantly, I authored a new city commission, which is entitled the Commission on Criminal Justice Reform, which is going to be a 11-member panel. And this is something that I will hope that the commission, once it actually is convened and all 11 members are appointed, that they will be working with the police department to work on these matters. I know that the Hartford Police Department is flying under the radar. Is that correct? Which is good, and so that we can continue to make sure that there's some racial justice that continues to be here in the city of Hartford.
Thank you. Next, Jason.
Good evening. My name is Jason Thody. I'm an assistant chief of police here in Hartford. I've been here for 22 years in the police department, and now I'm a resident of the city of Hartford as well. And my service here is probably the thing I'm most proud of. I brought some individuals with me here because I think that anytime we have an opportunity to engage in a dialogue and listen, the hardest thing to solve is a problem when you don't know what the actual problem is. So I look forward to listening to everyone, and as Councilman Clark said, while we have never been identified in this report, I don't doubt the fact that issues do occur here. So I hope that we can have an open dialogue and come to some solutions.
Thank you. Next, Jean Van Farah. I call him Van Fuda. Go ahead, John.
It wouldn't be the same if you didn't call me that, Bill. I'm the state senator representing about 60-something% of Hartford and about 85% of Wethersfield. And Ken mentioned some of the information regarding Wethersfield. And this is an issue very important to me, very important to my constituents. And I want to listen to people tonight. I want to learn tonight so I can play a role in the dialogue, play a role in addressing the issues. I believe that's an important part of my responsibilities. And I've been in this room many, many times over the years. This is the first time I've been in this room regarding this issue. And I think it's very fitting that you decided to come here, Bill and Ken. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Clawdeen?
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi. So my name is Clawdeen Fox, and I am a member of Hartford City Council, one of the newest members appointed in July. So I've been on the job for about 5 months, and it has been very interesting, to say the least. And in the last 5 months, I would have to say that working with the community around policing issues in our city has probably been my primary point of work. And so I am really excited to be here today, to be in dialogue and to be in community with all of you. I'm not a person that talks for the sake of talking, so I really, really hope to hear from y'all and hear what all of y'all have to say. And I just appreciate you for having me be here and represent all of you the best I can. So.
Thank you very much. I think the comments that I've heard already, it has set a very good tone. So I have some questions I want to ask members of the panel here. And one of the questions, obviously, is around the issue of profiling. Do you think profiling exists? Goes on. So it'd be interesting. I assume everybody in the House has an opinion. Okay, what's your opinion? Do you think profiling exists? Cheryl, you want to start?
Sure, I never miss an opportunity to start. So yes, the short answer is that our agency receives complaints of discrimination where individuals in communities across the state of Connecticut allege that they've been subjected to illegal discrimination at the hands of the police, that they've either been pulled over or had some type of contact with police, and it was based on their protected class status. Now, does every complaint that is filed with us end up in a finding of reasonable cause and a finding of discrimination? No. because the statute is clear that you have the right to file a complaint of discrimination, even if you can't prove your allegations. However, I have tried cases and I have settled cases where it was clear, remember I talked about the 4 kinds of evidence, that there was direct evidence that discrimination did occur, or there was pattern evidence that discrimination did occur, that individuals in the communities were being treated differently because they were a member of a protected class, because they were Black, because they were Hispanic, because they were Muslim, because for any one of the 27 protected classes that we have. So racial profiling does happen, unfortunately. Overall, in terms of policing in the state, is there an attempt to police in a fair and an impartial manner? Yes, I think overall that is the truth. But do we have in pockets throughout the state some systemic issues? Yes, we do. And I say that from a place of having tried cases and having litigated cases where individuals have made allegations and then there is evidence to support the allegations that they've made. It's very unfortunate when it occurs because it cuts very deeply for the individuals who are subjected to the discrimination. It also cuts deeply when police departments or officers are accused of discrimination and then there's no evidence to support it. So it really goes both ways. We have a serious problem in our nation with police community relations, and we're hoping through the project and through discussions like this that we can actually get at the heart of what is creating the distrust between police and the community and the police. And I wanted to just take a second to talk about anecdotes, because while we have legal definitions as we look at these issues, people's stories are important, especially when you look at them cumulatively, because that's how you can start to root out issues and problems with profiling and discrimination in the state of Connecticut.
TJ, you want to respond to that question?
Yes, sir. I do believe racial profiling does exist because I happen to have been a victim of being racially profiled by one of the towns that you had mentioned in the beginning. And I believe it is something that it is very disturbing. It could be very traumatizing as a African-American male when you know that you did not do anything wrong. You're driving a nice-looking car that happened either to be waxed or just washed, and regardless if the windows might have been slightly tinted or not, it should be something that you not should be subjected to an officer pulling you over for a non-traffic violation. And so that provides a stigma, and I think that actually permeates throughout our cities and our urban areas where you are targeted based upon not only your complexion, not only because of your gender, but also too by as Ms. Sharp was saying, a protected class. Why is it that certain individuals, it's okay for them to drive a certain type of vehicle, and certain individuals, predominantly people of color, cannot drive the same type of vehicle that a person that is Caucasian? So these are things that we're seeing across the nation, and is coming into our cities that we need to address. And I am all for improving community and police relations, and I recognize that that's something that is going to take continual work to do. And I do applaud our police department for making sure that a lot of things that have happened nationally have not prevented that from happening here in our city. And that started under Chief Ravella and is continuing under Chief Rosado. And, this is something that us as leaders need to continue to work on, so that as things take place in our nation, that those type of things are prevented and we can improve some of the systematic behaviors in our city.
Thank you, TJ. Chief, you want to respond to the question?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I don't think there's any question that racial profiling exists. As a police administrator, one of the worst nightmares I could have is repeating a mistake that happens elsewhere. So like many of the other chiefs in the state, we read. The Department of Justice has conducted many pattern and practice investigations across the country, and there's been many consent decrees written about that include issues of racial profiling, right back to here in Connecticut with East Haven. So I, as a fair and impartial policing instructor on implicit bias, we know that all human beings have implicit bias, and that leads to things like racial profiling. Like I said before, just because the report doesn't say that we have an issue, we monitor in the Hartford Police Department anyway. We monitor our citizen complaints, and we look for any undertones that could be motivated by race, and we correct those issues. I'll talk more later about some of the other things that we've done to try to prevent those things from happening here. But the reality is that they do happen, and they even happen here. And when they do happen here, and we can show that it happened here, how you address it is how you prevent future misconduct like that. Through our supervisors, through our training, and through our discipline process, we try to keep that evil at bay here in the Hartford Police Department. But yes, I do think it exists.
Thank you. John?
No question that racial profiling exists. I know this meeting is focused specifically regarding police, but I think profiling exists in many other places. Bias exists in many other places. Speaking for myself, I've taken upon myself over the last several months of this year to learn a lot personally about these issues. And I'm continuing on my own personal journey in this regard. And it's been eye-opening for me. And my sensitivity and appreciation level has grown greatly. And that work will continue. This is part of it tonight. And it isn't just with policing. If a person of color goes into a store, those who work there respond differently than if I go into that store. It happens in the workplace. It happens in the institution that I work in and that you were a major part of. People may speak. It's another question as to whether they're heard. So, this is real.
Clawdeen?
Thank you. I mean, we wouldn't be here if it weren't real and if we didn't think it existed, right? I mean, yes, I do believe racial profiling exists. I may not have been personally stopped while driving by police, but I have been followed in stores. I have responded to people following me in stores. I have been profiled at work. I have experienced all of those other things. And so it is very, 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 very real. And I think a large part of why it exists is our society's inability to look systemic racism in the eye and say that, yes, you are real, yes, you permeate all of our institutions, and yes, we build policies and institutions off of the foundation of systemic racism. And until we actually start saying that without fear and without fear of repercussion, nothing will change. And so, yes, racial profiling is very real, and it very much exists today.
Thank you. Now, you're not in this. Now, let me move now to something else. You now recognize that it exists. You've made that admission here. Now, what is your perception of law enforcers? So I'm really asking you, what are your perceptions of the police? I'd like to hear that. So, Cheryl, you gonna start again?
I can.
Okay.
I certainly can start again. My personal perception is slightly different from my professional perception. I would have to say my perception is informed by a statement that was made by a 22-year-old to me. He said every time he goes to get in, he's an African-American, college-educated, very soft-spoken black male. And he said to me in a discussion, every time I go out and get into my car, I wonder if it's my day to die. And so I was like, what are you talking about? He said, every time I go and get behind the wheel of the car, I wonder if it's my day to die because I'm scared. As a black male, even though I've done all of the things that they said that you do, that you need to do to live the American dream, every time I go to the car, I am wondering if this is my day to die. He said, because it just takes one person. We don't even have to look at systemic racism. It takes one person who's ill-informed, one person who has implicit bias. It takes one person who has been bred in this society to think that I'm beneath them, to have a bad day, and my life is over. And he was like, and I just don't feel like other 22-year-olds who are not in my same protected class feel that way. And he said, but that is how I feel every day of my life ever since I got my license. So from that point on, when I heard that, I doubled down on my efforts to try to provide education and outreach to the communities. I am born and raised in Hartford, Connecticut, in the North End. As you told your story about being in other areas where you're subjected to illegal discrimination, I thought that I did all of the things too, took all of the steps that you need to take so that you can have a successful life, so that you are not subjected to unfair or unequal treatment. But as I went to the courthouse to try a case that I won below that was on appeal, I had a judge say, hi, Attorney Murphy, hi, Attorney Kendall, hi, Attorney Luby, and look at me and said, what are you doing here? Are you here to carry the bags? And my name was on the brief that was written. So is systemic racism real? Yes. Is it an issue, not just in, as we talk about dealing with policing, but in employment and housing? Yes, it is a real issue. The question is, how do we go beyond our individual experiences, which may not have been positive if we're a person of color, and look beyond that to look toward solutions? Because as a professional, I'm a solution-oriented person, and we use the law to address social ills, right? And so we have laws that prohibit discrimination against individuals when they're being policed. But sometimes the law isn't enough. You have to have the conversation. You have to be frank in that conversation. So my perception as an individual, my personal perception is I have been profiled, I have been discriminated against, but I don't think that all police officers have the intention to treat people of color in a disparate manner. I don't believe that. I think that most police officers want to do the right thing. That most police officers go to work every day, they want to protect and serve, they want to go back home to their families, and they don't have this intent to treat individuals differently because they belong to a protected class. But I think that because there is systemic racism in our society, some individuals deliberately treat people differently because of the color of their skin or because of their race or their religion or their national origin. And I think that other individuals get caught up in the moment. And I think that some people just have implicit bias, that it's not an intent, but that when you look at statistically what they're doing, the numbers show that they're disproportionately impacting in an adverse way African Americans, Latino people, and people who are brown. Just like I think in our nation, we have that problem right now, that the policies that we are putting forth are disproportionately affecting Black and brown people, and that we have to do something about it. We have to not only talk about it, we not only have to have this dialogue back and forth where we hear each other out, but we also have to listen to what is being said by law enforcement. I've learned a lot sitting on the board. I learned a lot about policing and some of the policies they have in place and why that have nothing to do with race that I was not aware of. So education is important. But I also think it's important for not only the community to listen to what the police have to say, but for the police departments to listen to what the communities have to say. Because if more than one person is telling you something, you need to reflect on it and see what you need to do to maybe address their concerns.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Appreciate that. DJ, go right ahead.
Well, I grew up in a household with a police officer. My grandfather worked as a police officer for the city of Hartford for 30 years. He retired as a sergeant, and I think his last office was in IAD. So I was always Internal Affairs Division. So I always grew up with the respect of our police department. And I remember the days of growing up in school with Officer Friendly, so there was always this notion of being friendly towards a police officer. But it wasn't until growing up where I recognized that things change, and there always are some bad apples in a bunch, and everyone is not always going to treat you with respect. So I don't somewhat fear police for my life. It's not because of the fact of who I am and what my name and all that. It's more so my fear of police is for my sons. I'm a married man, and I have two wonderful boys, 8 and 6. And I think about what they go through during school and the conversations that I have with them on the conversations that they're having with their friends. And also, too, with what's going on in this nation now, and how my fear is for my sons as they grow up. As you were saying about that young black man, I just thought about my sons. I won't know once they leave the house as they grow up, are they going to return back home? Because you never know when a police officer is going to have a bad day, or when they're going to get caught up in some type of crossfire of that nature. So I do get frightened, and I am a prayerful man, but still, the reality is I am worried as the society extends on what's happening at the national level, and how that will trickle down to our local level, and how that will impact more so our black kids and our black young men, for that matter. And so I do respect the police, and I think I have this unique opportunity to serve as a member of the city council here in Hartford, to put forth policy that can be impactful, not just to black men, but our Latino brothers and sisters and every other minority nationality for generations to come, so that they can feel safe in our city. Everyone does not get the opportunity, such as I have, to serve on the legislative body to put forth policy. And so I do work hard, and I will continue to work hard as long as I'm a member of the city council, to work with the rest of my colleagues in the police department to make sure that our city is protected, to make sure that some of these injustices will cease. Because if not, then we're going to have a lot of issues on our hands. But I just a lot of times it's just sometimes these things you just can't formulate words to, because it's deep and it's very touching. And sometimes I wake up in the morning lamenting with all that I see, not just nationally, but here at the city level, and how many of our young kids are suffering. And it seems like, as what they say, that there's no hope for them. But I know that there is hope, but we just have to work with organizations such as this to make sure that we can put something forward to protect those that feel like they're lost.
And thank you very much, TJ. Jason, let me do this. I think it's probably an unfair question for you to respond to. I think probably, but if you feel you want to respond to the question, but I guess I'm taking liberties here. You don't have to.
No, that's fine. I mean,
Okay.
as a biased instructor, I can tell you that my answer is probably going to be biased. But listen, I've been a police officer for 22 years. Like I said, I think it is the most noble profession out there. The men, for the vast majority of the men and women that go out there and protect and serve our communities every day are doing God's work, in my opinion. I have a unique perspective on it because especially over the years and now that I've moved up in the ranks, I get to hear a lot of both sides. I've been involved in panels like this. I've been involved in a lot of community dialogue, and I have the fortunate viewpoint to listen to the community and understand where they come from. And let's face it, perception is reality. The perception of that 22-year-old is a very important thing. But I can tell you that the perception from my law enforcement officers, my police officers here in Hartford, is that they're concerned every day that they put that badge on, that their life is going to be taken as well. And that's real. You have to see both sides of the coin. There's fear on both sides of the coin. Our officers fear the unknown, our community members fear the unknown. The only way to eliminate that fear is through dialogue, is through understanding, because with that fear is danger on both sides. A snap judgment by a police officer, or a snap judgment by an individual that doesn't know how to interact with police officers or is fearful of police officers can end tragically on either side. That's my biased opinion.
Thank you, John.
I have had no one in my family be involved with law enforcement as a police officer, but I went to school at Berkeley High with a number of my classmates who became police officers. I don't know why so many did back then. All are retired now, but many became members of the Hartford Police Department. They were friends of mine. And I know some, less and less, as the years go by in the Hartford Police Department. I have great respect for those that decide to become police officers. It's a very difficult job, but one, as the chief said, can be very rewarding. But I learned in my work as a legislator that because you may know there's a case, if you'll indulge me a moment, that a legislator who wanted to be a judge, and he worked with former Representative Dyson very closely. He had pronounced on a number of issues, and legislators had a problem with him becoming a judge because he had pronounced on some issues that they felt had revealed his bias. But I thought after that how many lawyers came before the Judiciary Committee in the legislature and became judges that we know nothing about their bias. They never pronounced on those issues. They could have been members of the KKK, and we would not know that. And solely because you put on the badge, it doesn't mean that we know what their biases are. And that's where education becomes so important, where I reached out. I haven't reached out to you yet, Clawdeen, but I would like to. I did reach out to Councilman Clark regarding the makeup of the Hartford Police Department and how to change the process for training candidates. Right now, we make a call for those interested in being a member of the Hartford Police Department, as an example, and they go through a process. If you think about it in a number of other areas, and I don't mean to make light of it, but in sports, how do we determine who's going to make it in the NFL or the NBA or whatever? It's from when they're this tall. It's years of training. But to become a police officer in Hartford, it's weeks. And I think that we ought to, if we are serious about changing, I'm just using this one example, changing the makeup of the Hartford Police Department to reflect the community, we need to be serious about how we go about doing that, and the process of training should begin a lot earlier and last a lot longer and be a lot more intense, so that when a call comes for a new class, those individuals will be ready. I'll just say one more thing. This work, the work that I'm doing, and I want to extend that to my colleagues in the legislature, but it just doesn't mean in Hartford. You can drive into West Hartford, you can drive into any other town and encounter someone who may be biased in some way. The badge alone does not mean that there aren't those issues. I'm sure you encounter that on a regular basis, Chief.
As brief as possible. In this new position, right, that I've been in for the past 5 months, I have been wrestling with this idea of wearing many hats. And what does it mean when I'm out in the community? Which hat am I wearing? Am I still allowed to wear my hat as Clawdeen Fox? Am I allowed to wear my hat as Clawdeen Fox along with my identity as now a city council person? How do I blend those two identities in with also my 9-to-5 job where I work around community advocacy around health equity and systemic racism in health, right? And so I'm gonna put my Clawdeen Fox hat on right now as a resident of Hartford living 2 minutes away from here on Monroe Street. My perception, that's the question, right? What's my perception of the police?
Right.
To be completely honest and frank, I am afraid. And I'm afraid to say that right now, sitting up here, right? There's some like level of vulnerability where you're like, I'm scared of y'all. And I don't know how else to say it. I'm scared. While I may not be as likely to have a DWB experience, driving while black experience, like my colleague, Councilman Clark might have, you still never know what might happen, right? So then when I put on my other hat as councilwoman, I have had many conversations with myself about how do I not face these fears, but how do I allow these fears to be real and do work against those fears, which is why I also sit on the Public Safety and Quality of Life Committee, because I do believe it's important to create these dialogues and to have these conversations, but that still doesn't eradicate that underlying fear. To piggyback off of what Senator Fanfara said around, yes, Hartford could do all of the work in the world around implicit bias training, that still doesn't account for the folks that exist around Hartford and the police departments around Hartford. Black folks and brown folks in Hartford don't just stay in Hartford, we drive everywhere, right? And so I can't be the only person, regardless of all of the hats that I wear, that also maneuver through this world with this fear. And so how do we continue to build this dialogue where constituents can feel safe in Hartford, but then can also feel safe in Wethersfield? And yes, I hear it and I recognize that officers wake up every day and, face the challenges of their job. And we as constituents shouldn't have to wake up every day and be fearful that when I get in my car, that's gonna be the last time that I leave my house and I'm never coming home again because I'm dying. So, yes.
Thank you. Appreciate your responses from everyone. What I'm going to do is cut them off now, and I'm going to have you, whatever questions you may have, comments you may want to make, keep them short, but it doesn't mean you can't come with as many as you'd like to have. And while you're thinking about what those questions might be or comments you want to make, what they might be, let me introduce you to some other members that are in the audience who are part of the group itself. Is McGuire here? Yeah. Okay, there he is. ACLU. Cato, you want to?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Cato Ransom in the Connecticut community.
Thank you. Is somebody I'm missing? Oh God. Tamara is here. Tamara, stand so I can see who you are.
It's your birthday, too.
It's a birthday? Oh, man. Okay. Anybody else here? And these are good people concerned with trying to provide an answer for the issues that we're dealing with. Do we have them? No. Doesn't mean we won't come up with something. So now I need to have people who got questions here, who may want to comment here, and love to. Yes.
Tim Sullivan. My question is more, I appreciate gathering all the data and hearing those stories and personal experiences. And I understand, I worked for a number of years in New Haven, which is a pretty good city. But I think addressing Mr. Barone specifically, what's the result of these interactions with police officers, isn't that, like fundamentally your next step? That you want to see what happens when somebody gets stopped in whatever town, we'll say Wethersfield, West Hartford, Leon, whatever. When they get stopped, what's the result of that interaction? And get a real picture of just what this behavior is. I appreciate, I helped with Working Families Party on the issue of cameras on cops. And I think you get a lot of information out of that.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Tim. So we have a process in Connecticut where we do this statewide report, and then maybe we identify a department. I should be clear about a few things. One is there are racial disparities, and that's a fairly technical term, right? That doesn't mean that if we identify racial disparities in a department, that doesn't mean that, there are cops out there saying, I don't like people of this particular group and I'm going to stop them, right? That could be occurring, but data you necessarily won't come to that conclusion from the collection of data. So the system we have is a triage system, right? We're identifying those departments where the disparities are so large and occurring across so many different ways of looking at it that we say, okay, we need to figure out what's going on here. So that's not to say that because Hartford, as an example, isn't identified in our annual report, that there aren't disparities in the data and things that they should be working on. As a staff, there's a few of us, and there's 107 agencies. So I view our work almost as triage. We're trying to find those that need the most time and attention. The next step that we do in Connecticut, which is different from any other state in the country, is we then sit down with the police department and members of our advisory board, and we try and ask questions and figure out why the information looks the way it does. And we try and better understand the nature of policing in these different communities. And one of the things that I learned very quickly is that policing in Hartford looks different than it does in Wethersfield, than it does in West Hartford, than it does in East Hartford, than it does. There are similarities in policing in general, but there are also unique differences based on the needs of any particular community, okay? And you've got to imagine now, as a fairly young white male with no background in policing, going into a police department to have a conversation about race in and of itself can be somewhat awkward. The reception isn't always warm initially, okay? But we always try and approach this from a perspective where we're there to listen and learn, and we're also there to see where the information takes us and leads us to. And we've had some really wonderful results in Connecticut in that we've gone into a number of agencies, engaged them in, and I'm going to give you one example in a minute, in robust dialogue about what's going on in the department and what's going well and what's not going well and what might be causing a disparity. And as a result of our conversations, they've shifted or adjusted the way in which they do some police work. And I would say the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of the police agencies, those 29 departments that I mentioned before that we've identified and done individual reports on, my experience, I've left there with a fairly positive experience. Not always agreeing. We don't always come to the same conclusions, but usually there's a level of respect. And so let me give you the example, very real example, and this is a department that took a fairly radical approach, I think at the time, in how they were going to address some of our findings, more so than other agencies. And I'll tell you the story about the Hamden Police Department right outside of New Haven. And I think it's applicable to the conversation today, because again, the vast majority of the 29 departments that we've identified over the course of the last few years have predominantly been whiter suburban communities that border major urban centers, right? And that's not just the case around Hartford. It's been the case for departments around Bridgeport, departments around New Haven. And in the case of Hamden, what we found were significant racial disparities. We met with the department, and they started talking to us about all the challenges they have in neighborhoods in and around the city of New Haven. And it's not a conversation that's all that dissimilar from conversations we had with departments that border Bridgeport and border Hartford and border Waterbury and border New Britain, et cetera. And the conversation, and what we noticed was that the neighborhoods in and around the city of the border of New Haven were heavily saturated with law enforcement. And the nature of policing changed fairly drastically, meaning the further you got away from the border of New Haven, police predominantly looked for violations that are usually more closely linked to motor vehicle safety issues. They were stopping cars in white neighborhoods for rolling through the stop sign and blowing the red light and talking on their cell phone and people speeding. And the closer you got to the border, the more the violations that people were being stopped for were, you know, a license plate issue, defective light, a window tint, so we call those, higher discretion, right? There is less of a correlation between those types of violations and the safety of the roadways. Not to say that somebody without brake lights can't cause an accident, but to say that all the accident data tells us that speeding causes accidents more than lighting violations do, as an example. And so the conversation with the police chief was, why does the nature of policing change the closer you get to the border of Hartford, and predominantly in the black neighborhood? And the police chief said, well, that's very easy. We place our resources there because that's where our calls to 911 come from, and that's where our higher levels of crime are. Okay, so we got the information and we saw that there were higher call volumes, more people calling 911 from that area, and there was marginally more crime in that area. And so then the question was, okay, well, now explain to me why the enforcement strategy, why you go into that neighborhood saturated with police and stop them for more equipment and administrative offenses than you would, say, more safety-related offenses. And the chief said at the time, well, that's easy, right? We're stopping cars in an effort to get drugs and guns off the street. So we stop a car for any technical violation of the law in hopes that we can search the vehicle and deal with some of the violent gun issues and drug problems that we're having in the community. And so logically, this all makes sense, right? But the question that we posed to the police department was, is it an effective strategy? Because we know that the strategy is causing racial disparities. We know that it's causing minorities that are driving from New Haven into Hamden to be treated differently than white drivers coming in from, say, Wallingford into Hamden or Cheshire into Hamden. And so can you at least support in the data that the strategy is effective? You get the guns off the street, you get the drugs off the street, you curb the crime, you curb whatever it is you're trying to curb. And if you can prove that, then it just is an unintended consequence of the way in which you feel you need to police. So we drilled down with the department, and what we found was that of all the vehicles that they stopped in that part of town for these low-level equipment-related reasons, they found contraband only 7% of the time. But that's where the vast majority of their searches were. And the contraband that they did find was most often less than half an ounce of marijuana. So we're not talking, trunks full of heroin, and right, what we're talking about is fairly small amounts of narcotics, and there were no weapons recovered. So we went back to the department and said, the results of this strategy don't appear to be achieving the return on investment that you might want. And to the chief's credit, he said, I don't necessarily know that this is going to work, but I'll tell my guys to stop making those types of stops. I'm going to tell my guys, when you make traffic stops, you focus on things that cause accidents. You have it be safety focused. And if you build a good probable cause to search a car, search the car, but stop asking everybody in the black neighborhood if you can search their car, right? Because that's what they would do. They would go in, they'd ask for consent. Minority drivers are more likely to give consent. There's a whole psychological reason why that's occurring. He said, stop doing it. And he said, I have to be honest with you, I think my crime is probably going to go up, but let's see. So a year later, we looked at the data and we found three things. The racial disparity disappeared. Okay. The crime rate dropped 5%, which tells me there wasn't necessarily as big of a correlation between your strategy and a reduction in crime. Their accidents dropped 15%. Why? Because they were focused on the behavior that causes accidents. They kept the saturation of officers where they felt they needed them. They didn't take 5 officers and put them in the white neighborhood. They kept officers where they felt the calls for service were and where they felt crime was, where they needed to have a presence. But the nature of policing changed, and they had officers out walking the streets more and talking to people more and creating a different interaction. And what we found since then is that the Hamden Police Department has not been identified in any of our further studies. And they went from being one of the towns that made the most equipment-related and administrative motor vehicle stops to making some of the fewest. And so that's an example of going in, engaging in it with the department, having a tough conversation. They start to experiment and try and understand if they're getting the return on investment they hope for, and they're using data to make these decisions as opposed to some history of this is the best way to deal with crime. Instead it was, this might be a strategy, but let's see if it works and let's measure it. And so those are some of the conversations we have with departments.
Okay, thank you. Yes? Who is that? Okay, you next. No, she's going to do it now. You next.
Can you give us some information about the southeastern Connecticut areas such as the...
I don't think they hear your question.
Can you give us some information about the southeastern Connecticut communities such as Norwich, New London, Mystic, Groton, because I believe that they were on the list at one point in time?
So we have identified, right, there's no part of the state that is immune from racial disparities in traffic enforcement. In fact, I led off the conversation today saying that I think we need to accept this fact that race is playing a role in policing and in particular in motor vehicle enforcement. There are a lot of factors that are causing it to play a role, so I'm not trying to place that solely on the feet of law enforcement, but I am saying that to say that it is a very real factor, and it's a factor in all quarters of the state. We also have identified in previous reports the Norwich Police Department, the Groton Police Department, as two that come to the off the top of my head. What's really interesting about the research we've done, something that I think we're all still trying to work with and understand is, I think if you were to go to the community, the vast majority of people, and you were to say, where do you think racial profiling exists? The first place they would point to is Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, New London, Waterbury, New Britain, right? And those are the agencies that tend to get a lot of the media coverage, right? Incidents occur and they have more officers, and so when behavior isn't necessarily appropriate, there's a lot of attention on those jurisdictions. But we have to remember that the vast majority of law enforcement officers and police departments in the state of Connecticut aren't our major urban centers. We have 94 municipal police departments, and the vast majority of those departments are fewer than 50 officers, and they patrol, again, predominantly white suburban communities. And of those 29 agencies that we've identified over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, not one major city has been identified as reaching the threshold of having such a disparity that they become an outlier. Again, I'm not trying to say that there aren't problems in urban centers between minority communities and law enforcement. There are. But I am saying that the biggest red flag, in my mind, having done this now, not just in Connecticut, but also in the state of Rhode Island, is the nature of policing in predominantly white suburban communities is something that I think we all need to look at, consider, and understand more, because that is where the most significant disparities exist. And the truth is that there should be a fundamental principle that we all agree to, which is that everybody has freedom of movement, has the freedom to move in and out of a city and through communities, and they should feel just as safe in Hartford as when they leave Hartford. And I think that is some of what we've got to do. We've got to learn more about that and educate ourselves more.
Thank you. That's right.
And I want to know also what happens
think that police officers, one thing we have to remember about police officers, myself and every other police officer, is that everyone's a human being. To think that you're going to go into, to imagine sitting in a car and knowing that you're going into a call where there's gunfire, where the dispatchers are laying, that you can hear gunfire in the background. You pull up to the call a block away like you're trained to, and you get out of your car, and while everyone in the neighborhood is running away from the gunfire, you're running towards it. To imagine a human being, whether they wear a badge or not, that's not fearful at that point, I think would be unrealistic, and I would be fearful of that person. We train our police officers. Our academy in Hartford is 6 months long. To Senator Fonfara's quote, that's not long enough to face some of the dangers that they face today. When you turn on the news and you see that police officers are being, in some instances, ambushed in their cars and things like that. These officers leave their families every day to go out and, like I said, and run towards the gunfire and try to protect life. And that's why I refer to it as the most noble profession. I don't think I can train, or I don't think our academy can train fear out of police officers in general when they're facing a situation like that. The one thing that I've seen in law enforcement, our officers in the city they tend to get a lot more life experience in that area, and they tend to respond to those situations very calmly in comparison to other places where they may not get that kind of experience. But I can assure you that they do get training. We do all the simulating that we can. We make the training as reality-based as possible. The President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing talks about reality-based policing. But what we can't do is shoot at them and try to replicate what that does to a human being. So I do think there's fear on both sides. That's answering your question on the police side. I obviously see the fear on the other side, but to imagine a human being, a police officer that puts that badge on and goes out and does that job every day, that's not in some way fearful that they're not going to return to their family, I don't think that exists in even the most bravest of officers.
Thank you. You have a follow-up question? Okay, make it short for me.
I'm not clear as to how they're not prepared to handle a dangerous job. That is, I don't think it should be based on fear. And I don't know if you said that. I don't know if you said, yes, we train them to be fearful, or no, we train them to be prepared for the dangers, and not to fear, but to care. I don't know. I just feel like that it wasn't really addressed.
We don't train our police officers to fear. I'll get that out of the way right away. That what we try to do is prepare them, to mitigate emotion. The more we can prepare them, the more we can train them, the more realistic their training gets. It mitigates emotions like fear. But we know scientifically that police officers get tunnel vision. Fire department, a good example. Folks in a fire department will get tunnel vision. Folks in the military will get tunnel vision. You're faced with life or death situations, and we're not the only profession that does that. And we might be defining fear differently. But it is a natural human emotion that officers are going to have. That fire department, we don't have anybody here from the fire department, but I can assure you if they're going into a burning building that there is a level of fear there. Some of that fear can keep them from making bad decisions that can hurt them and other people. So we train officers to harness that, to deal with emotion. We try to make it as realistic as possible so it mirrors a situation that they're going to have in the community. But again, I think a lot of people's expectations of police officers is they're somehow, when they put that badge and gun on, and this is my point, is that they become a superhero. And they're not. They're just people, and some are better at certain things than others. That's why we have different divisions and places to put people, but they are just humans.
I mean, I know that everyone probably caught this, but I'd like to just have us stay with it for a moment. The young lady in the back raising the question about fear, that there's an element here, and Jason is talking about the training and what we don't do in terms of fear, but that societal impact may be a part of all this. Now, what I don't want to have happen, but is going on, and I think it's important to do, and that is two different positions here on a critical issue and two people engaging in a dialogue to get some understanding about it. That is major, because normally we don't have that. We don't have that kind of fear. Let me give you a story, and I want to get to Clawdeen in a minute, and the young man over here has a question. Thanksgiving, I had my grandson show up. There he was, nice kid, 17 years old, and he got this haircut that used to be up or something, I don't know what it was, and he changed. He changed, and now he wants to mat it down, and he's wearing a do-rag. And this is the first time I'm seeing this guy with the do-rag. So I'm trying to figure out, yo, bro, what's going on here? And what I know from that is that the moment I took a look at him with the do-rag on, and he's matting it down, and this kind of gait in his walk, I said, this guy is about to get killed. This guy is about to get killed, and it's my grandson. And I am helpless to do anything about it. How do I shelter this kid? How do I keep him safe, this kid? How do I resolve the issue between the two? That is the ultimate issue for all of us. Does that dialogue address the issue that all of us fear in a big way that impact our lives? How do we leave here tonight and not have some notion about beginning that process of understanding what that fear is? And we have to do it. We have got to do it. Because if we don't, nothing is accomplished. Nothing. Who's going to be the first to speak? Who's going to talk to the merest hour? How do we embrace what needs to be? Where do we go from here? And that's a quote made by Dr. Martin Luther King. Where do we go from here? And then I get to you in the morning. I got Clawdeen here, and I got a young man over here that wanted to speak, so I need to get to them, and then I get to you. Okay, Clawdeen, go ahead.
I'll keep it quick as always. And I think that's a really, really great segue into this discussion around fear and what I believe Madam Selders is speaking to around fear and this question and this notion about fear on both sides. I think social media and society and just the media in general kind of plays into my fear specifically, right? Every day. And what we see in the media is not, the statistics of Trayvon Martin, the statistics of Mike Brown, the statistics of these folks that were not engaged in gunfire, were not engaged in anything violent, so to speak, and still lost their lives at the hand. Sandra Bland is the case that messed with my heart and messed with my head and will continue to forever and ever and ever, right? Tamir Rice, right? And so I'm not saying these things just for like flash and tweet me and hashtag me and all that stuff. I think I'm really trying to speak to the fact that folks are really trying to understand and this dialogue around implicit bias, which I know you are doing work around, is really trying to figure out where that fear comes from, of just Black and brown bodies existing. They may not necessarily have to have a gun. They may not necessarily be engaged in any violent crime, but we still find that folks and bodies that are moving through the world are dying for no reason. And so when we hear fear on both sides, I don't think we're thinking specifically about gunfire, but we're thinking about these people that were just walking down the street and lost their lives unexpectedly. If that provides like any clarification around what she was trying to say.
Thank you very much, Claudine. Let me get the young man here. Yes, sir. And make sure everyone hear you now. That's $1 million question. You know, I mean, anybody want to TJ?
You know, I struggle. I can relate to that question because I don't know where that stereotype came from. Because hoodies, as long as I can remember, have been around for eons, as well as sweatsuits. And all of a sudden now, ever since Trayvon Martin, there is this issue with seeing young black men with hoodies on as now a person that they should fear, and their radars go up. I'm a person, everybody thinks that I wake up dressed like this and I dress like this 7 days a week. But if you actually know me, I like to dress down like you. There are my days I love to wear my hoodie and just relax. And going back to my sons, I took a picture of them, it was last 2 Christmases ago, in their Under Armour sweatsuits with their hoodies. And I looked at them, I'm like, my God, they can't go around looking like this because of this now implicit bias, this stereotype that these are 2 young black boys that could be mischievous and get into all types of trouble. So that is something that I believe that we've got to change, that perception. But you know, where actually does it end, or sometimes where does it start? Because of the fact of we could launch a campaign of no more discrimination against black men who wear hoodies, but that's got to actually touch all points. And unfortunately, you know, this is something that we should not be living with, not in 2018. Though these type of things, you know, that should have been eradicated a long time ago. But I think that we are now trickling back to the civil rights era of 1960s, which we should be way ahead of that. So this is the time where I think that you as yourself, and I'm assuming you go to Hartford High. Are you a senior? You're a junior? All right, myself and some other distinguished gentlemen, will be at your school on the 17th. Between 12 and 2 to talk to the young men over there. We're going to be talking about this issue here. But this is something that we need to be making sure that we're advocating for, just not on the local level, the state level, and also the national level, to make sure this type of bias and inequity is actually comes to a halt.
Thank you. Go ahead, you have a follow-up. Why don't you come up here so you can speak into this thing? No, come here. Yeah, bro.
Like, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to fix am I supposed to act like them and like change the way I dress, or just keep it going with my culture, like the way I like to dress, the way I like to style myself, the way I want to dress? Do I have to change and be more like the person they want to be, or do I?
No, you be you. Because if you think about it, people in other cultures don't change how they look. So why should we? You should be proud of who you are. Don't let society change who you are.
But ours is kind of getting targeted right now.
Yes, that is true. That is true. But this is the moment where this is the thing. We should not be constantly living in fear. And that's a fear tactic. And so what you should do, you should continue to be strong and be bold as to who you are. Operate within the confines of the law, but always know that you have rights. And your rights should be protected. So therefore, if you feel that there's some type of discrimination, then you got CHRO, you got other areas where you can go to file your complaints. But don't change who you are just based upon who they think that you are. Show them. There are other ways for you to show them who you are. You can be intelligent, educated, rich, dressing like that at the end of the day. Be proud of who you are.
Also, I would like to add that if you believe that you're being discriminated against, you should file a complaint. And a complaint can be filed with the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. You get 180 days to file the complaint. There is a notice that should be given anytime there's a traffic stop. If you get pulled over, that you should be receiving a notice that indicates if you believe you're the victim of illegal discrimination to contact our offices so that a complaint of discrimination can be filed. I think it's important, and you have a lot of courage, young man, for coming forward and sharing what your perception is, what your belief is about the treatment. What I would love to see, and what I think will change the conversation and what will move us in the direction towards healing, is to now have the police department reach out to that young man, not just that young man, but all the young men like him, to let him know that we don't want your perception to be reality. So we need to have this dialogue, and we're going to work on this together, because this is not an anecdote. This is not a story. This is a real feeling that young people in our community are having on a daily basis. And do we want to have kids, young people, juniors and seniors in high school, be traumatized to the point where they feel that they have to become somebody else, that they can't show their culture in their dress? Because if he's moving through his life and being a respectful, responsible citizen, and he wants to wear a sweatshirt and a pair of jeans, that should be fine. Because like you, I don't dress like this every day either. I cannot wait to go and change into a t-shirt and a pair of comfortable pants. And I don't expect, if I then want to go to the store or get in my car and drive somewhere, that I'm going to be targeted because of my skin color or because I no longer have on a suit. And I don't have a really fancy car, so they're not going to pull me. I won't be pulled over because of that. But I should not have to feel that. As we are trying to be human beings on this earth together, working with one another, living amongst one another, we should be able to move through spaces and not have that type of angst and fear hanging over us in every action and move that we make.
Thank you very much. Now, here's what I would want to happen, if I might, and I just want to throw this out, and that is, we have some police here tonight, and we have people here who are concerned about the issue. You ought not leave unless you're talking to each other. It may be hard, but you ought not leave unless you have comments with each other, because dialogue is not going to take place without that happening. Let me get the young man right here, and then you're next. Okay. I'd like to respond to that at some point, but let me get the other man and I'll get back to that. Okay? Yes. Make sure they can hear you now.
I'm going to piggyback on the young lady about fear and the young man, right? So, our society right now, right, is young men and women with discipline. Right, so the Hartford community right now.
No, don't say another word till you get here.
Thank you, sir. So the Hartford community right now is experiencing trauma. You just heard the young man, right? You say that police officers get trained and you guys are very well equipped, right? And you guys are getting the training to deal with this trauma every single day. But you guys are getting a crash course in the trauma and all this stuff, right? Where our young men and young women are being traumatized since their birth, right? And they're being traumatized since their birth, but they don't have that training to deal with you. And like one of my young ladies, she's here, and she says that she doesn't know why the moment she walked in, she seen the police officers, and she got nervous. Okay? Thank you. You know, that's the thing right there, is that we don't have that training, okay? Where you guys have that personal development training every month, maybe? Once a month, maybe, I'm saying, right? That's the disconnect right there. We need to figure out how is it that we can maybe bring in the community members into your training so that it could be more realistic, so that you can see the fear that you create, because you guys, excuse me, I don't want to keep seeing you guys, but police officers getting a training, they're also getting that trauma that is like induced trauma, right? Because like you guys are creating it so you guys can get the response you want, right? And then our young men aren't, and so when you pull them over or whatever, they you know, hell, I'm 40-something years old. I get pulled over, I still get nervous, and they come over and they be like, "What are you nervous for?" Dude, you just pulled me over. But I'm not, you know, I have to stay shut. I can't say that. You know, I'm like, I'm not nervous, or they were like, whatever. But you know, that's the type of effect. I want to know what is it we can do to fix that, because our kids are traumatized. You just heard them. What are we going to do about that? Because you guys know that there's trauma. You guys, you know, that's the key word right now. Everything's about trauma informed, trauma informed, trauma informed. How is that policing going to take effect?
Thank you very much. You want to respond to that, Jay?
Sure. I certainly do appreciate the sentiment on everyone's part. That's not a problem that you know I can solve today, or that the police officers that I have here in the audience can solve today. That's something that we have to work with for a long time. Whether it's the perception of what you know, what a young black male is up to when he's in a hoodie, that is implicit bias developed countrywide, probably outside of countrywide, not developed just in you know, policing. The officers that we have that come in to literally 6 months of us training them for 8 and sometimes more hours per day, you can't always push those implicit bias out of their head. What we try to do is find new ways. We had sensitivity training when I first came on the job, and basically it said there's systemic racism, and you have to forget everything that you ever learned about people that are different than you. And we found out that didn't work as training. What we try to do now is work on things like contact theory. You know, when I first got on the job, you didn't get a community service officer position in the north end of Hartford unless you were black. You didn't get a community service officer position in the south end of Hartford unless you were Hispanic. That's not how we are going to generate understanding. That's not contact theory. You have to put people in uncomfortable situations, controlled environment, not uncomfortable situations during a car stop or something like that, where they can gain an understanding of that. It starts very young. It starts in the school system. You know, we have tried, especially recently in the Hartford Police Department over the last 5 or 6 years, as Councilman Clark knows, to develop Explorer programs, PAL programs, where we're trying to teach some of our youth. We have school resource officers that go out into the schools to try to alleviate that fear. I don't think you're going to strike all of the fear, you know, away from our youth in one broad swoop. That's a societal change that has to change over time and over generation, through parenting, through positive interaction and things like that. we're also not going to avoid the fact that negative interactions are going to occur. That's something on a national stage, on a local stage, that if I could find the solution that prevented police misconduct or misconduct in general, or systemic racism or implicit bias against things like wearing a hoodie that make no sense, I'd probably be a rich man. But the dialogue is what's important. In the city, I've gone out. We had courageous conversations a couple of years ago where I went out and did a crash course in implicit bias. I tell the officers as I teach them implicit bias training that I wish we could give that to everybody. But we do a lot of things: Citizens Police Academy, forums like this, that we're constantly see a representative from our department there to have that conversation. I think that's the best thing that we can do, is make a commitment to develop understanding and reduce fear.
Thank you. Ken want to respond to previously then.
Just real quickly, I wanted to talk a bit about the idea of implicit bias. Probably 5-6 years ago is when law enforcement in the state of Connecticut and really around the country really gravitated towards that idea and training on implicit bias. And it's very important training. And I can remember, that being said, this is more of a comment and I don't necessarily have the solution. The Department of Justice came in a few years ago and trained a number of us in this fair and impartial policing program. There's probably 40 or 50 trainers that are certified DOJ fair and impartial policing trainers, and we were going to go out into police departments and train them on implicit bias. It's an important topic. I went out and did a training every other week for a year. I trained ran the training program for probably close to 1,000 police officers. What I walked away with, the first time I went in, a little naively, I said, this is going to be great. We're going to be changing the way that everybody thinks and about implicit bias and how they approach their jobs. This is going to be wonderful. And I left that first day going, oh, that didn't go well. Okay, and then I figured it must be me, right? So then the second time around I went in, I said, all right, I know what I did wrong the first time, and I know how I'm going to get through to these guys, and there's a new group of predominantly men, so 40 officers from a variety of police departments around the state of Connecticut, and I left there going, oh, boy, that didn't go well. There's a resistance. And the truth is that through those trainings each week, I met a number of wonderful people, wonderful officers, thoughtful, engaging. But culturally, there needs to be a shift in the profession to genuinely accept this training. My sense every week I went in is that people were looking to check a box. Yep, I did it. I did implicit bias training. And I also thought as though the state was looking through us to be a vehicle to say, look, every officer in the state of Connecticut's gone through implicit bias training and now everything will go well. Implicit bias training is a piece of it. But I don't do it anymore. I stopped doing it because I became so discouraged by leaving those conversations and just feeling like I was not getting through. Part of it was I'm not a law enforcement officer, and so when sometimes it's harder when you don't share that same experience with them to necessarily get through to them. But the message should have still been the same. And so I do think there needs to be a level of reflection and on the part of the profession of law enforcement to think about culturally to what degree are they contributing to the fear and to the creation of implicit biases on the part of members of the community and members of the police department. And like I said, there isn't necessarily an answer to this, but it is to say that I walked away feeling as though after training almost 1/10 of the police in the state of Connecticut, culturally we really have to, as a profession, there has to be a lot more reflection on the role that they're playing in the larger race discussion in the state of Connecticut. And implicit bias training is good. It is nowhere near the shift that we need to see before we start seeing some of these trends reverse.
Thank you. Now you want to come in and use it? Come on. You next.
Good evening. Throughout the night, everybody is expressing fear. And, and not only in the state of Connecticut, but nationally, fear. And what fears me so much as a mother and a grandmother, is the fact that when people are murdered by law enforcement, they're being killed and with impunity, and that is really, a concern. You mean you can murder somebody with impunity? I think that that's something that needs to be addressed. We see it every single day. When we open up our social media platforms, I make sure that I look at all of them, because I don't want to take any of these incidents for granted. But I think that that's an issue that really, really needs to be addressed. Not only, I'm not saying only in Connecticut, but across the nation. And what happens in one part of the nation, it affects all of the nation. So I think that that's something that we really need to address one of these days soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Claudia. So my question is,
Make sure they can hear you.
Right there.
Hi guys. Okay, so my question, I guess, is more about, we're talking about systemic issues, so how do we go about systemic change? And so I was wondering how we had that great narrative when you were talking about how you went into that police department and said that your statistics are not matching your outcomes. How can we change that? And how they became more informed, they made a change, it was better. How do we mandate it that strategies are based on statistics? Is that possible to do, where we can't just have policing that is based off of other ideals? And also, at what point does bias become a disqualifying factor towards becoming a police officer? Because I understand that not all biases can be trained out of you, but to me, if you hold a certain level of bias, you cannot do your job as a police officer. So at what point do we say, we can't train this out of you, so therefore you cannot hold this position? Or can we do that at all? And how can we move towards that?
I'll just quickly respond to the sort of the policy question. We've collected a lot of information. We've done a lot of research. The question really needs to be posed, and I think maybe we have to do a better job of framing the conversation for our policymakers in Hartford. There are things that policymakers can do to try and recognize and address racial disparities in policing. Some of them, however, can be viewed potentially as somewhat radical. But that being said, I do think that there are things that might be an appropriate response to some of the disparities we're seeing. And I'll just use one example of an area that policymakers can delve into. Consent searches. A consent search is when an officer stops a car and they ask you, right, do you mind, you give me permission, right, can I search your vehicle? Okay. Consent searches are used for a variety of reasons. There's a difference between a consent search and a probable cause search. Probable cause meaning I've developed probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed or is being committed, and therefore I have the legal right to search your vehicle. Consent is, can I search your car? You say yes or no. Most people say yes. What we know is that minority drivers are significantly more likely to be asked for consent. And consent searches yield little to no return on investment, meaning the rate at which law enforcement find illegal stuff when they ask if they can search a vehicle is less than 10%. Probable cause searches yield a return on investment, a rate at which they find illegal stuff more than half the time, right? So what's something tomorrow legislators could do? Not tomorrow, they're not in session, but you get my point, right? Curb the use of consent searches. Right now, I understand that there might be law enforcement might make the argument that there's an appropriate investigative place for them in policing, but at some point we have to weigh that against the racial impact that it's having on society. Another example, we know that that stopping vehicles for having a license plate light out is significantly more likely to occur to a Black or Hispanic driver. Okay. Now, the intent of that law is to ensure that the license plate is illuminated so the officer can read the numbers on the plate, right? The intent, I understand the intent. The intent by the legislature when they passed that law was good. What we know is that it affects one group of people. And we also know that in 2018, all license plates are reflective. So the headlights of the car will light up the license plate. And those little lights are really not necessary anymore, right? But a large amount of minority drivers in particular are stopped for that reason. At some point, right, the legislature should consider and say, okay, again, we understand the intent of the law. The intent was good, but we also understand that it's having a large racial impact on only one group of people, and maybe we should eliminate that law as an example. So these are the types of tough conversations that I think legislators should be engaged in. We should be looking at the reasons why people are stopped, and when we see that certain groups are being stopped for certain reasons that other groups aren't being stopped for, we should evaluate the efficacy of continuing to do that. And I don't know one way or the other, right, how it should come down, but I do know that those are the types of concrete things that legislators can do when presented with this information.
Jason, John, you want to respond?
Thank you, Bill. I won't be able to answer. I'll leave the recommendations to Ken and to the commission. I will say this, though, that the Connecticut legislature obviously reflects Connecticut, right? We elect people from where they live. And Connecticut is a very segregated state, overwhelmingly white. And I can tell you that the overwhelming percentage of my colleagues do not have an appreciation of the issues we're talking about tonight. They watch and they see on television and social media like everyone else does, but they do not have an appreciation. And I'm committed, working with some of my colleagues, to finding the right process, the right forum, the right means to have my colleagues learn. If they want to learn or don't want to learn, I can't answer that. I can't get in their head or their heart. But I believe we need to create that opportunity. And you can't appreciate these kinds of recommendations if you come from a place where somebody's complaining, somebody thinks that, well, they shouldn't be involved in situations that get them in trouble. They shouldn't, there's just not, I know this. I say this with complete certainty that the overwhelming percentage of my colleagues do not appreciate what people in this room have experienced. And until we can change that, it's hard to change laws. I served with Alvin Penn. He's no longer with us, but he fought for this. And you can get things passed that people feel, oh, okay, Alvin wants that, Senator Penn wants that, he can have it. But will it result in, when it changes, when laws have to change that affect them, that's a different story. Totally different story. And we're not going to make the progress we need to make until we can change laws that affect them as well.
Thanks, John. You have the...
Can I have...
You have the hand up right here. Who had the hand up right here? You did? Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
You next.
So from a municipal standpoint, again, I'm new. I move through the world through a lens of equity, specifically through racial equity and health equity, right? And so a couple weeks ago, I was in San Diego for the American Public Health Association conference, and I went to several breakout sessions that focused on public health and municipal government, and kept hearing about this thing called GARE. And GARE stands for the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And one thing, and it's basically all about how do you bring a racial equity lens to municipal government. And the main thing that I walked away from those breakout sessions were centered around questions that myself, as someone that has, the agenda packet for Monday's council meeting was just emailed to us today. It's like 100 and something pages long. I have to sit through and read all of this stuff. What are some questions that I can ask as I'm reading that I can then ask in the breakout committee meetings, right? And the most important question that I will begin to implement is who does this policy impact the most? Who does this policy harm the most, right? So like we create ordinances and resolutions centered on problems that people bring to our table and bring to our offices, but rarely, I believe, do we ask, who does this harm, right? And so we think about the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so who is being the most vocal about a problem and who does our solution harm? And so I think from my standpoint, something that I can commit to doing now is asking that question. And I feel like a lot of the time the answer might be really obvious, but it might not be obvious for a lot of people. And so starting that dialogue right there from like, who are we hurting when we decide to vote yes on this policy is something that we can do at least.
Thank you. Yes?
My question is for the chief.
Speak louder.
My question is for the chief. I wanted to know why is the police trained to kill instead of to disarm? Because I feel like that would fix the problem of unarmed people of color being killed.
Thank you for your question. So the training that we do is to stop. Years ago, we only, when you faced a significant threat, your tools were much more limited than they are today. But if it is a deadly force situation where an officer has to use a firearm, they are trained to stop. Somebody that is a 300 shooter, we call them, that means that you don't miss. When you're in training, even if we try putting sirens on, we try using lights, we shoot in low light conditions, we try to put stress on police officers. An officer that has a perfect score, that is a sharpshooter, that never misses, will only hit the target around 15%, between 10 and 15% when under actual stress. So to think, the small fist of a person is kind of the target that we shoot at on the training targets. Some of our officers can put, all 60 rounds, 60 bullets of a qualification right into that little fist. Under stress, they would hit the target only about 15% of the time. So we train our officers, if they have to use deadly force, to continue to use whatever force necessary until the threat stops to them or to a third person. So we don't train to kill. But it's not realistic to train to like shoot the gun out of someone's hands either, because of the physiological reaction that people have under stress. That being said, we're always looking for more less than lethal options. Tasers.